All right. Welcome to episode 3 of the PR and Law podcast. I am your host, Cam McMurchie, with employment lawyer Ewan Christie.
Hello, Cam. How you doing?
All right. Not bad, Ewan. Good to have you back on. I am a PR guy based in Hong Kong and publisher of the Digital Bits PR and Communications newsletter at digitalbitspr.com. And Ewan practices law at Duntroon LLP in Toronto, Canada at duntroonllp.law. Okay, just a couple of things to deal with before we get into the show this week. If you enjoy the podcast, please tell a friend. It's literally kind of the only way we have to get word out that we're doing this show and that we're providing information for PR and legal people and just other professionals. Some of the issues that we're talking about. And we're also on social media: LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Across all of those accounts, we are at PR Law Podcast. PR Law Podcast. So you can find us on any of those four channels. And if you'd like to support us, we would really appreciate that as well. You can find us on Patreon. You can go to our show website at prlawpodcast.com and click support show. All right, Doc, what's going on?
Well, weather's finally starting to get warmer here in the Great White North, Cameron. That's always exciting. Of course, the springtime is a little bit different here than normal, given all of our social distancing rules. But, I got to say, I was a little frustrated this week in that there are a lot of people out there who do not seem to be particularly conscious of what's going on and ensuring that they are practicing social distancing or wearing masks. I was at the St. Lawrence Market yesterday. St. Lawrence Market is a huge market, and I think National Geographic voted it the best market in all of North America. It's one of the best in the world. And I was shocked when I went in. I was going to visit my butcher and what have you. Nobody was wearing masks, or at least very few people were. And few people were practicing the social distancing rules that have been, imposed by the province. And I then came home to find out that there was a rally down at Queen's Park, where the provincial government sits. And, a lot of these individuals talking about, we need to be free and I need to get my hair cut. Our premier came on television and called them a bunch of yahoos. And frankly,
is that the term that he used?
I have to agree with them.
Yahoos?
Yahoos.
Oh,
Yahoos.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. But I got to agree. This stuff is really, really frustrating to see. It's like it only works when everybody gets involved. And Toronto is a huge city. We're, the fourth largest city in North America. We need everybody to be on board here, because if we only have a certain segment of the population that are listening and observing these rules, the whole thing collapses.
I agree. Let me dive in. I want to get back to that, Ewan, because that drives me insane. But let's do a quick update. All right. I like our little hip hop COVID music here. All right, so just a couple of things. I'm going to pass it over to you in a second, Ewan, to cover up North America. But obviously, COVID-19 is still a huge issue. The death toll grew 3 to 4% per day globally over the last 10 days. So there are a lot of people dying from this. There's now 2.9 million cases of COVID-19 with 200,000 deaths, just over 200,000 deaths. And, taking a look at Asia, in Hong Kong, we've been doing well. Today we had 0 new cases, and several of the last 7 days we've had 0 new cases. So obviously people are feeling quite good here. But one city that is having a horrible time with it is Singapore. And, when the first wave came around in January, February, Singapore was held up as a model, along with Taiwan and a few other places, for doing such a good job. But in the last 7 days, Singapore had 931 new cases, and they're up to 13,000, which is really remarkable because there's about 6 million people, I think, living in Singapore. But it's similar to Hong Kong. But these two cities have gone in completely different directions, in the last month or so. So what's happening there, Ewan? I mean, you mentioned Toronto, and you're right. That drives me crazy because, I've said this before. If people don't want to wear masks, then fine, don't go out. But if you do go out, you have to do this for other people. It's not you. I don't care if people think that it's fine, that COVID-19 is just the flu, whatever. I think they're wrong, but they're entitled to think that. But don't put other people in harm's way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And what, another thing that's sort of interesting, where I live in what would be better known as Little Bangladesh. It's a very, very multicultural neighborhood. Kind of a quickly gentrifying neighborhood, but very, very multicultural and diverse. And I went to my local grocery store a couple days ago, and what was interesting was that most people were very, very respectful of the rules. Most people were wearing masks. They were practicing social distancing. And yet, yesterday, as I was telling you, when I went down to the St. Lawrence market, which, the price point is certainly much higher. It is generally speaking a more kind of upper middle class clientele that shop there. And yet you don't see the majority of people wearing masks. And that's also frustrating too, because it sort of implies, at least anecdotally, that there's still this segment of the population that feels some sense of entitlement. And I think it's that sense of entitlement that is what really, really frustrates me. Somehow that they don't think that they're part of the problem, and therefore they don't need to be part of the solution. Well, I mean, that's just ludicrous. As we've seen, COVID doesn't discriminate. It can harm anybody. And we all have to be collectively conscious of that and get involved, practice social distancing, and wear your masks, please. Wear your masks.
And we talked about this a little bit before, but and I know my dad listens to this podcast, so sorry, Dad, before I even go into this. But, there's a lot of people that I come across in North America, not here, who just think that this is somehow a surreptitious, power grab by governments who want to control people and begin, controlling social life and the way people interact, and that this is all sort of some big scam. And how could people be so foolish to give up their liberties and their freedoms so easily? And I don't understand this line of thought at all. And I don't know. I mean, this is what's going on in the U.S. too. I mean, there were a lot of protests, last weekend about wanting to be let out. Some great signs and stuff, by the way, from some of those rallies. But I mean, governments don't want this at all. They would love to have people out at businesses. I mean, we know that whether it's state governors or provincial premiers or higher levels of government, it's mostly their election is mostly dependent on economic performance. And this virus has been a disaster for economies all over the world. That's not good for governments. It's not good for elected officials. So this is not something they're enjoying. This is not something they want. It's something they want to get rid of as quickly as possible so we can all go back to work. So I don't quite, I think this conspiracy theory stuff, which I mean has always sort of been on the fringes, especially in the US, it's just become so mainstream, and it's just, I'm getting so tired of it now. Just the incentives don't even align in this case. I mean, there's no point. I don't see what the government would be benefiting from, in this sort of situation.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, Ontario has a conservative premier who ran on a very populist platform. And I thought it was interesting when you have our premier standing up referring to these individuals who are out there protesting, a bunch of yahoos, then I think that's really indicative of what's going on. And his argument is exactly the argument that you just summed up. Nobody wants this. This isn't good for anyone, and it certainly isn't good for the economy. But that the only way we can ensure that we're back to some semblance of normal is when everybody observes the rules and practices social distancing. It's not going to work if only a segment of the population does, and that's just going to stretch out the period of time that we're all staying home and that the overall economy is compromised. And to that point, I wanted to just briefly anyway run over some of the numbers, because again, as we sort of talked about last week, they continue to be just staggering statistics around this stuff. So we've had so far 7.1 million Canadians that have applied for some form of financial aid, which puts our unemployment rate at 7.8%. And that number is somewhat misleading because that was the number that was sort of put forth before the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit was made available. So I suspect that number is going to jump. In the U.S., we saw another 4.4 million Americans file for unemployment benefits last week. So that brings the total in the U.S. to 26.5 million claims in 5 weeks. And that translates to an unemployment rate of almost 21%, or the highest level since 1934. Interestingly, from a more global perspective, the IMF, I mean, it's now forecasting that the pandemic will shrink global GDP by 3%, also the largest annual drop we've seen since the Great Depression. But, Cam, where this gets really interesting is when you start to break down the numbers. There's been a lot of sort of really incredible and astounding statistics that people have been quoting through this whole thing. But I think one of the craziest ones that I've seen is that in the first quarter of the COVID outbreak, China's GDP dropped almost 7% in the first quarter. That's the first quarterly contraction on record for the modern Chinese economy.
I know that that's a staggering number, but it's also I feel like it's also obvious. I mean, if this is not a normal contraction. I think if there was a big contraction over the course of normal economic operations, it would be a little more notable. But I think when you look at China in January, May, especially in February and into March, like the entire country was shut down. And when you consider the size of the economy there, in some measurements, it's already larger than the United States, and the amount of manufacturing done there. I mean, 7% doesn't really surprise me when you look at it that way.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree. I think it's to be expected, but I think still as a historical marking point, it's still a pretty incredible statistic. But I think what's arguably more significant, and look, I mean, the comparable number in the United States is insane as well. I think, Goldman Sachs projected that the U.S. GDP will shrink by 34% in the second quarter. But, what's really, really interesting about these numbers is where this goes over the long term. What are going to be the implications in terms of the broader globalized market and international trade agreements? One of the things I thought was kind of crazy, and I wasn't aware of this, but prior to the COVID outbreak, China apparently accounted for 50% of the world's mask supply, and since the outbreak, that production has increased 12-fold. They're producing approximately 115 million masks a day, but of course they're keeping most of them. And we saw in the news a little while back, the U.S. issued sort of a similar edict with regard to 3M and its production of the N95 masks, effectively stating that they had to stay domestic. And, a lot of countries, particularly Western nations, have relied on cheap goods coming in from markets like China, particularly medical supplies. And, I think there's going to be a shift in the way that we think and we approach the production of goods. And I think we're going to continue to see an increase of domestic goods that we would typically rely on to import from other countries. I think we're going to see that shift. And that could have really, really interesting implications and consequences in terms of labor markets globally, labor markets domestically. And I'm very curious to see where this all goes.
All right, really quickly, off the top, I had mentioned Singapore had 931 new cases over the last 7 days. A correction, that is 931 new cases today, which is Sunday in Asia. So that's almost 1,000 new cases. It's a huge problem there. Wow. To the point that you were making, I was going to save this for the end of the show because we are going to introduce a little recommendations section towards the end. And one of the items I had today was actually maybe one of the only times I'll ever mention a Fox News interview, but I mean, this circulated quite widely among China affiliated people on Twitter, and it's a Tucker Carlson interview with a McKinsey veteran, and the person had worked at McKinsey for 34 years or something, or maybe it was more than that. So a very long time, and kind of had a front row seat on sort of the outsourcing of manufacturing and other industry overseas, primarily to China. And Tucker actually mentions this point, and he asks him directly, do you feel responsible for this? The fact that, Americans don't have enough PPE, they don't have enough masks, in some cases, they don't even have enough medicine. And these are things that were outsourced to China over the last 20 years. And I think you're right. I think, the attack on globalization really began in earnest with the election of Donald Trump. I mean, he looks at, global trade in kind of a mercantilist way. But I think, there were some skeptics at the beginning, but it's interesting now, like some of the criticism of global trade has become bipartisan in the United States. I think, Republicans and Democrats both feel that it's time to confront China on trade issues. And I think when you see, this outbreak happen, it's just putting more juice behind that argument, and it's just making more people come around to realize that there are national security considerations to global trade. It's not just about finding, the cheapest factory in the poorest country. It really is about, securing these materials, for instances like this. I mean, one instance that happened a while ago too is just rare earth minerals. I mean, I think you've heard about those. They're used in a lot of technology products, but I mean, most of the rare earths now are in China. And a few years ago, China was sort of playing politics and saying they weren't going to export those, and it meant that Japanese companies, couldn't make phones and cameras and televisions and things like that. So these are really serious issues, and I think you're absolutely right. They're going to be moved to a priority placement as companies come back from this and begin rethinking their supply chains.
Yeah, and I think it's there's been a bit of a trickle down effect where this was predominantly the domain of CEOs and government legislators, but I'm conscious of one particular image that was circulated quite widely in the Canadian press, and that was an image of a huge plane returning from China, and it had traveled to China specifically for the purpose of picking up masks to bring back to circulate to frontline workers.
Was that the New England Patriots plane? They actually came.
It may have been.
Yeah, Robert Kraft, the owner of the Patriots. This is related to the company I work for, in fact. He needed to secure additional masks and PPE from China. And, right now it's very difficult to move back and forth because of all the travel restrictions. So Robert Kraft used the New England Patriots plane to fly to Shenzhen, where it was given clearance to land for 2 hours, and the plane was loaded up with PPE, or just with masks, actually, no PPE, and immediately flew back to Boston. So there have been several cases of things like that because China's where the masks come from.
Well, this was a different. Then this was clearly a different plane. This was a plane that was chartered from Canada to China to load up with masks, and there is this image when the plane landed back in Canada, and it was empty. There were no masks. It came back with next to nothing, and that image was circulated widely across the country. And I think that was interesting because for a lot of a lot of laymen perhaps that aren't necessarily inclined to follow the political implications of these issues or global trade, what of course anyone can relate to is, well, I need a mask for myself and I need a mask for my family, and I want to make sure that the doctors that are helping people and the nurses that are helping people on the front lines, that they have masks. And why do we have planes coming back empty with nothing? And why is it that we're reliant upon a foreign market for all of the domestic masks? So I think you've got people thinking about these issues in a way that they weren't thinking about them before.
Okay, in the case you're talking about, actually Canada did secure the masks, and they did secure a shipment, but quality-wise they fell short in testing and quality control. So Canada had gone there, they had got them, they ran them through tests, and they failed. and that's why the plane was empty. So those are concerns too. China has been criticized for providing. It happened in Europe as well. There were a lot of masks and PPE sent to Europe that ended up sort of failing quality requirements. And I mean, that's sort of an offshoot of what you're talking about as well. It's just that, there are a lot of high quality masks being made in China, but you do have to do your due diligence. And I think Canada got caught a little bit on that one. Anyway, I am noticing, I mean, here in Hong Kong, like I was out where everyone's back to work. So, I'm going to the office. It's now 2 weeks I've been going to the office. Subway system here, which is the MTR, it's full, it's crowded. Streets are crowded. Everything's open. Malls. I mean, it's not 100% what it was before the virus, but during the week it's busy. I mean, the restaurants are packed. I was in Toi Wah the other day, and every table was taken. So we're back at that level, and you're still seeing no new cases day by day. So I mean, it's a really good sign, I think, for elsewhere. If you can keep the really strict guidelines on masks and social distancing, and you can hold it for about 2 months, you can end up in a good place. But I think Singapore, like we talked about, that's the case that's the opposite. They were doing well. It can look like you're over it, and then end up with being one of the hardest hit countries in the world. So that's another thing. We can't really, I don't think there's ever going to be going back to exactly the way it was before. I think too much has happened. I think people are going to be wary of shaking hands and, being around people with colds or the flu. I think mask wearing is going to become a lot more common. I think there's a lot of people that will not wear masks no matter what, but I think we're going to see more of them in more countries, as a result of this too. And another sign of life in the U.S., a big deal was the NFL draft. It's interesting because obviously all the sports leagues are shut down, which is a problem because sports, Broadway, music, movies, these are all escapes from daily life, and so in a case like sports, it's one less thing to kind of distract you from all of the negative news related to the virus. But the NFL managed to hold its draft, with people at home. I mean, the commissioner of the NFL was at home. The various teams were broadcasting from their own, the homes of the general managers and the coaches, and it was quite a production. I think in years. Many years into the future, we're going to look back, at 2020 and just think like, wow, what was going on then? Look at the stuff that happened, and how we managed to hold these kinds of events. It's kind of amazing.
Absolutely, but I mean, it also shows that there's no reason why that can't be done. I understand that it's not ideal, it's not optimal. Part of the excitement is, you can sort of cut to that player that wasn't drafted, that was expected to be drafted in the first round. I get that, but it's not like we can't structure these events remotely. And you raise a great point. I think this is going to fundamentally alter the way that sports is broadcast going forward, and possibly the way that it's played at the professional level as well.
And just an anecdote from me. I mean, I wasn't using video chat or even just, online conferencing software very often. In my career, obviously I've had to have Zoom meetings over the years, or Skype or Cisco WebEx kind of meetings. But the company I'm working in now is a global company. And so we have offices in the United States and, in Malaysia and many other places. So, keeping in touch with them means a lot more online conversations. But then, you add COVID into it as well. And so, virtually every conversation we have internally is over one of these networks. And, for me, it's become so second nature already. Like previously it would be maybe we'll have a call later this week at 4 p.m. to 5 p.m. Let's book everyone's calendar. Now it really is just, hey, do you have time to talk about this? Yes. Does this person? Yes. Okay, let's jump on a call. and we're all on and we're connected via one of these software programs. So I think that's something that has changed. It's just become so much easier to connect and to talk. And I think there will be an impact on travel to some degree. There is one app that was released, and I wish I could remember the name. I'll try and put it in the show notes. But it replicates the idea of going to a conference. So if you go to some sort of a seminar or conference, a multi-day event. I mean, obviously there's coffee breaks and there's lunches and there's sort of networking afterwards and there's cocktails and all of these opportunities to run into people and to talk to them and to introduce yourself, which is very, very hard to replicate online. But there is one company, and I wish I had the name of it. I'm going to try and find it, that has managed to do that. And they have become huge very quickly. And I have not tried it, but apparently it replicates some of that you can bump into people, you can quickly chat, with strangers without making an appointment to meet somebody. So I think a lot of this is showing companies, governments, a lot of us that a lot can be done online. I'm in favor of doing things in person. I like meeting people. I like going out, but it's much better than I think people thought it was online, and it can do a much better job than we anticipated.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. I was having a chat with one of my colleagues the other day who he conducted a mediation virtually. And, mediations are a really, really interesting aspect of the legal process. And they're sort of conducted a little bit differently depending on where you are. In the employment bar, and most areas of law within Canada, the process is, you have lawyer and lawyer's client in one room, opposing counsel and their client in another room, and then you have the mediator who goes in between rooms. You go back and forth, and you effectively try and negotiate and grind out a settlement. And of course, it's important to be present and be in person, so you can sort of see how the mediator reacts. You can interpret hand movements, gestures, eye contact, those sorts of things. But my colleague was saying that he didn't really notice that big of a loss. He was really concerned about it, but he said, it wasn't really that big of a deal. It actually was kind of cool. It was kind of neat. You sign into a separate room that you have just with the mediator, and then you have a separate room with your client. You can have breakout rooms, and he said that it was really, really cool, and perhaps a sign of things to come. And he's not the only one that I've heard that from. I've heard that from a number of lawyers that I keep in touch with, who have conducted virtual mediations, virtual examinations for discovery. And they've all said that, yeah, you know what, it wasn't that bad. It wasn't that big of a deal.
Okay, Doc, this is a nice little segue. We're talking about law, and I know there is one particular thing that you wanted to talk about today, and I believe it has to do with China, which is convenient for me because it's next door. So what have you got?
Yeah, I've been reading a lot of articles, as I'm sure you have, over the past couple of weeks, about the prospect of companies suing China for effectively dropping the ball and failing to advise foreign nations of the implications of COVID, of the threat and health consequences of COVID. And I think it's important that people sort of understand where we're at with that, because I've been speaking with some people who say, oh, well, hey, these companies can just turn around and sue China for this, or everybody should sue China. It's like, well, it's not really as simple as that.
Yeah. And I want to ask about that. Like if I mean, you're the lawyer, I'm definitely not a lawyer. If I feel wronged, if my business had to get shut down, or if I lost my job and future earnings as a result of this, or, I mean, I'm not even sure what classifies as something that you could take to court. I mean, how would a company or a business or a government go about this?
Well, it's a really good question, and this is not something that typically falls within my bailiwick. So, but I spent some time doing some legal research around the issues and the particular statutes, and it was very enlightening, very, very interesting. So, there's this doctrine. It's called the doctrine of sovereign immunity. And in the U.S., they have the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act. So this was an act. I won't bore you with all of the details, but it was an act that was passed in 1976. Canada has a similar act called the State Immunity Act, and these statutes were effectively passed to protect foreign sovereigns from the burden of litigation, including cost and aggravation of discovery, et cetera, in foreign countries. And the whole idea is based on this notion of sovereign reciprocity. So you can't sue us and we can't sue you. And it makes perfect sense because, frankly, if we lived in an international legal community where every country could sue every other country every time they had some sort of dispute, I mean, the whole system would just completely collapse. It's just not practical. But that said, if a control of a company turns out to be private, then the sovereign immunity defense doesn't apply. And, Canada's legislation has a similar commercial activity exception. So, all of these lawsuits, they're all arguing that they fall within this particular statutory exemption to immunity on the basis of, commercial activity.
How many lawsuits are there?
Well, I mean, that I'm aware of, at least in the U.S., there's been six large ones that have been reported on, and most of them are proceeding as class actions. So large claims where you've got multiple plaintiffs.
So what are they claiming? Like what is their argument? Like what's their justification?
Well, yeah, good question. I mean, one of the actions that was filed in the state of Florida, they're suing China for negligence, for negligent infliction of mental and emotional distress, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and they're effectively alleging that China and other defendants, because I mean it's crazy. I was looking at the statement of claim, and they are suing the People's Republic of China, including the National Health Commission, the Ministry of Emergency Management, the Ministry of Civil Affairs. You name the ministry, they're named in the claim. And they're alleging that these defendants, they knew that COVID-19 was dangerous and that it was capable of causing a pandemic, yet they slowly acted. They proverbially put their head in the sand, and that's actually language from the claim. We can provide a link to it in the show notes, and or they covered it up for their own economic self-interest. So those are the allegations. So really, really interesting stuff. But where's that going to get you? And I think, and I mean, I'm no expert on this point, but I've certainly been reading on some of the lawyers who are experts on this, and the general consensus seems to be that the litigation will fail based on the doctrine of sovereign immunity.
Wasn't this an issue? Sorry, Ewan, to cut you off. Wasn't this an issue with 9/11 as well? Because there was talk of suing Saudi Arabia, for sort of harboring terrorists. I can't remember what happened as a result of that. I know for a while there they couldn't, but then I thought eventually they could.
Yeah, and again, I'm not familiar enough with what happened to sort of speak on it with any form of authority. But I know that there is some language in the legislation that speaks to acts of terrorism. But again, I don't want to speak to sort of the implications of that because I'm just not familiar enough to sort of comment on it.
Okay, so I mean, again, as a layman, they're suing China. So how? I mean. Well, does the Chinese government get like a letter from a court in Florida saying, we expect you to appear on such and such a day, or what is the actual logistics of this?
Good. Well, yeah, good question. I mean, well, let's sort of stick with the one example of the piece of litigation in Florida. So, I mean, yeah, they're suing within the state of Florida, so they would go before a judge in Florida. And try and make their argument, make their claim. But of course, to your point, even if a court was to take the position that, okay, hey, this falls under the sort of the commercial activity exemption, and China can't be protected by by sovereign immunity. How are you going to enforce the judgment? Right.
Yeah, exactly. This seems like it's kind of futile.
You going to send an email to somebody at the PRC and say, hey, you owe us however many millions or billions of dollars? It's not really practical, but I think more importantly, and this is sort of a bigger thing, even if you were able to get a decision, and to proceed on that basis, this could start, a complete and utter global mess. Because frankly, if China, they could then take a similar position vis-a-vis the US. They could say, okay, great. So you're going to completely disregard the doctrine of sovereign immunity. So you know what? We're going to do that as well. And we're going to start filing claims against, the U.S. government or U.S. companies that would typically be protected. So nobody really wins if we go down this road.
Yeah. And, it does sound futile then. I mean, it just seems like a waste of time if it's, set up this way and there's actually no way to compel China to take it seriously. And I have no doubt that China would not take it seriously. I know that a lot of our listeners are back in North America, but I mean, from over on this side, I mean, mainland China has been running a very, very slick propaganda campaign domestically for the last 6 to 8 weeks that really is highlighting America's struggles with the coronavirus. The fact that hospitals don't have PPE, the fact that they're short of masks, the fact that there's, so many deaths in the U.S., and they're pointing out that this is proof, that the Chinese system is superior, that they're able to look after their people much better, and don't they feel so much safer being in China instead of being overseas where chaos reigns. And this has been pushed day after day after day after day. So, if it looks like this virus started in China, in or around Wuhan. That's what we know. But there's been enough doubt sowed into this in terms of what the Chinese media has been saying. And I think people will be aware of a foreign ministry spokesman in China suggesting that it was the U.S. brought the virus to Wuhan as part of the military games. So I guess militaries converged to sort of do a mini Olympic style games. And in 2019, it was held in Wuhan in September. So, I mean, that allegation was made by the Chinese government with no evidence to support it. But when you take a look at muddying the waters that way, as they did in China, and with the U.S.'s slow and somewhat poor response, it is effective. I think it really did effectively kind of shut down some of the anger that Chinese people did feel towards the Communist Party. But it's really hard to say for sure, because there are no independent, polling of Chinese people.
Right. So we effectively have to take their word on it.
Yeah. I mean, but you can see stuff online. I mean, it's, that part is effective because you can go up there and talk to people as well, for the journalists that are still there. Anyway, the good news, there were a lot of foreign reporters in Wuhan over the last week, in fact, because the city opened up on the 17th, I believe. And people are, even outside there now, but there is, in some of the reports I was reading from there, there's still this sort of simmering kind of, I don't know if I call it anger, but there's a desire to know what happened. How did this happen? Where did it come from? Who dropped the ball? Why did it get so bad? Because, Wuhan was really, really under lockdown there for quite a long time. And, a lot of people died there as well. So I think, there's going to be questions for quite a long time. And I mean, also, looking at some of the comments by foreign governments, I think China is going to face a lot of pressure when this is done, because there is a lot of anger at China for this. And when you consider, I mean, there were plenty of warnings in advance about these wet markets in China and some of the exotic animals that were being sold there. This isn't a new thing at all. When you consider the economic impact this has had globally, Dominic Raab in the British government, UK government, has already said there's going to be a reckoning with China when this is done. And there's been other similar comments as well. And I think it's It's going to be tough. It's going to be ugly. I think, the days of global cooperation and globalized trade and open borders, those days are really behind us now. I think there's no doubt about that.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. There's going to be a fundamental shift. But I mean, I look at the Canadian government hasn't really addressed how they're going to deal with this. I mean, our prime minister has been peppered with questions of, are you going to hold China accountable? Are you going to hold China accountable? And then the position thus far has been, look, we're focused on protecting our own population, getting us back to some semblance of normal. And once that's said and done, then we can focus our efforts on responsibility and taking proactive action specifically against China. And I think there's probably a lot of governments that are taking a similar position. But, then you look to the U.S., I mean, and again, my understanding is that there's now members of Congress that have drafted legislation in a specific attempt to remove China's sovereign immunity to sort of enable companies to go after the government. And now, again, how successful is that going to be? The articles that I've read, and, we can link to one in the show notes, which is a great article by a partner in the U.S. who was a former legal advisor to the State Department, John B. Bellinger III. And he seems to take the position that, this probably isn't going to go anywhere, but at least speaks to the general sentiment that governments and the population are very, very, very angry at China with regard to what's transpired.
Yeah, there is some sympathy, I think, in terms of, these kinds of viruses have appeared in other places as well. I mean, in Japan and in the Middle East and places like that. But the response, China is praised, rightfully so, I think, for its response as of about January 20th. It's either the 20th or the 23rd when the government formally announced the lockdown and that this was an issue. But between, some people say it's in end of November or sometime in December when the virus first started really spreading quickly. There was valuable time lost there when nothing was done. And the people that were speaking out, such as Dr. Li Wenliang, they were ignored or forced to close their mouths because it was deemed a rumor by the Wuhan government. So that lost time there has really impacted everybody. And so, while China did the right thing, as of late January, it absolutely did the wrong thing before then, and it should be held accountable for that.
Yeah, I'm with you. As are most people, I think.
Yeah, I think so. I do want to go into the PR item this week, and because it is related to China, and it's related to some of the nationalism that's going on there. So, just a bit of background for people. China has not been overly nationalistic in its history. There have been periods like the Boxer Rebellion, where there has been a lot of anger at the outside world or at foreigners and things like that. But when you go through the Cultural Revolution, I'm not going to give a history lesson on this podcast, but, when you go through the Cultural Revolution, there's a lot of upheaval, there's a lot of poverty, there's a lot of struggling. And into the 1980s, in the 80s in China, it was opening up quite a bit. And that led to 1989. Which resulted in that which we cannot name happening in Tiananmen Square that year. But as a result of that, the Chinese leadership decided, it's time to get people more patriotic. It's time to get them, a little more unified. And, patriotism or nationalism is an effective way to do that, as we've seen throughout history. And so the result now is, if you navigate the Chinese internet space, like with Sina Weibo or WeChat and those areas, you do see a lot of nationalism, a lot of anger. Sometimes there's a lot of anger at foreigners, like there is right now. In fact, because of the virus spreading so much in the U.S., there are many restaurants in Beijing that simply say no foreigners allowed, and you can't go in there. And in Guangzhou, which is in southern China, near Hong Kong where I am, There are places that won't allow black people inside either. There's actually videos circulating on Twitter where black people try to walk into a shopping mall with white people, and they'll let the white people in and keep the black people out because they believe that COVID has been spreading in Africa, and therefore these people in Guangzhou are risks. And I should note that Guangzhou has a very large African community, so I mean it's been a problem, and a lot of the consulates there have been trying to help out some of the displaced Africans in the city, because many were actually kicked out of their apartments by the landlords as well. So, I mean, that's a huge story. But there is one instance where nationalism clashed with another country, and it's a bit of a crazy story. I know this did not get covered in the international media, so that's why I kind of wanted to bring this up. And we're not going to go through every detail here. But it basically started over this. There's a TV soap, and it's called Together, and it's popular in mainland China. So people like the show quite a bit. And the male lead in that show is a Thai national, and his nickname is Bright. So he's become quite well known. Bright is quite well known in mainland China as a result of the popularity of this show. So Bright actually has a girlfriend in real life, another Thai woman, and she goes by the name New, N-E-W. And so these guys are a couple, and it's kind of well known in the entertainment industry, the situation with these two. But here's the problem. Bright recently retweeted some photos taken by a professional photographer on Twitter, and he just retweeted them. But the photos were from multiple places in the world, and the caption was, "Taken from 4 countries." Ewan, you might already detect where this might go sideways. One of the images was of Hong Kong. So, Hong Kong, where I am now, I mean, it does have a border around it, and it does have its own currency and its own laws and its own government. But it's technically not a country. It is a special administrative region of the People's Republic of China. So people in mainland China, especially with the protests here last year, they got upset about this, as they do. They've done this, with Taiwan multiple times as well. They've Marriott, I believe, last year, the year before, listed Taiwan as a country, and Chinese people called for an online boycott of Marriott. So anyway, naturally, Bright was criticized for this. And they told him in no uncertain terms that Hong Kong is a SAR of China, and Bright apologized for the offense. Now, number 2, the mainland internet users dug up a photo of New, his girlfriend, which she posted to Instagram while she was in Taiwan. And this is September of 2017. So they went back through both of their social media accounts and found this. And it's actually a photo. I'm going to send a link with this breakdown and these actual social posts so you can take a look at it. And she's actually just in the photo by herself, and she's standing in the middle of the road. And Bright leaves a comment there and just says, "So pretty, just like a Chinese girl." New responds with some casual Thai, and this is where some of the controversy has centered. If you translate her remark, it's a one-word remark. It translates as "what?" But actually in colloquial Thai, people are telling us that it's more like writing or just sort of an acknowledgement. Anyway, mainland Chinese internet users obviously put that phrase into their translators, and they found "what?" Which they took as a slight against China, because if you read it that way, Bright says, "So pretty, just like a Chinese girl," and she says, "What?" as if she's sort of taking offense to the remark. So that was round 2. Mainland nationalistic internet users kind of went nuts about that online. And then, number 3, mainland users dug up a post retweeted by New that said the coronavirus had originated in China. Now, some have said the retweet referred to the virus as the Wuhan virus, which obviously is a sensitive terminology that Chinese people and many people around the world reject. But again, the translation isn't quite clear. It could be that, or it could be something close to that. I mean, as you know, translating can sometimes be difficult if you're trying to get a direct meaning. Anyway, these three offenses basically resulted in hundreds of thousands of remarks on Twitter of Chinese people really attacking these two online, and it was very patriotic, nationalistic in tone. Now, here's the interesting part, because I think this really helps us understand sort of where China is at in terms of the communications there and the media and some of the messages that are shared with Chinese people throughout the day. Eventually, Chinese people began attacking the Thai government. So they went after the government for some of its sins. I believe there was a large incident several decades ago that Chinese people dug up and began blasting, Thai people for the poor performance of their government and for poor governance and so on and so forth. But what's interesting about this is the Thais, and you've been there, Ewan, many times, as I have been. They're very sort of relaxed. It's a great country. I mean, they're known as the land of smiles. But once Chinese people began, criticizing the government and the leadership in Thailand, the Thais jumped right in. They said, yeah, I know, it's ridiculous. Our government's horrible. But this really confused some of the Chinese people, because it's just something they would never consider saying. It's not that it's not permitted in China, but it's just, the Communist Party has done such a good job of fusing itself with Chinese identity in general. So if you criticize the Chinese government, it is like you're criticizing all of China. And I think, one thing I remember, a good example of this is in the 90s, I remember under Jean Chrétien, people said that he had sort of fused the Liberal Party with Canada, and he had done a good job of that, and it does work. It pays off, for the political party that can do that. So I think, the Chinese people were very confused why the Thais just sort of agreed with them, and also took pot shots at their own government, and it did leave Chinese people very perplexed as to how they could do this, why they would do this, and it was just so far outside of their own expectation, of what people might say. That's the biggest sort of tell about how the information ecosystem operates in China, and I think that kind of nationalism and patriotism and sort of the assumption that all other countries are exactly the same is something that has hurt companies in the past. I mentioned Marriott. There's many, many others. And I think it's still a risk for a lot of companies doing business in China, that they have to understand that this is an environment that is very different. I mean, we know other countries can be patriotic or nationalistic to some degree as well, but it's unique how it manifests itself in mainland China. I will say, just as an addendum to this, there were some excellent memes flying back and forth, really, really hilarious ones. And I'm going to provide a link to actually a story I wrote about this on my blog, so you can take a look. And actually, if you go on Twitter and you hashtag NNEVVY, so double NEVVY. That's actually news sort of Thai name hashtag. So if you put that into Twitter, you'll see some just amazing stuff going back and forth. And one of the things that really came out of it, because once China is involved in sort of a conflict like this online, naturally Taiwan people want to jump in, and Hong Kong people want to jump in because they're not happy with the Chinese government either. And so they have formed what they're calling the Milk Tea Alliance. 3 countries, or 3 regions, I should say, that all have milk tea, that love their milk tea: Thailand, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. And I think it's a beautiful alliance, if you ask me.
The Milk Tea Alliance. Wow, I love it. That's great.
Yeah, if you haven't been to Hong Kong, milk tea is something that's hugely popular here, and it's sort of made with condensed milk. I don't know. It's an odd drink, but I'm at the point now where it's a comfort food with me. I've been here long enough that there are days I crave it. But Thailand has excellent milk tea as well, and it is slightly different. And I guess is Taiwan milk tea similar? I actually don't know if I've had it.
Yeah, I mean, Taiwanese milk tea is fantastic. Especially the oolong or the jasmine milk tea. It's really really nice. But of course, the bubble tea is very 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 popular in Taiwan. And for those who may not be familiar with bubble tea, it's effectively it's a milk tea but with little sweet tapioca balls in it.
There's
it's a
shops
really sort
everywhere
of
selling that.
jarring. It's a very jarring experience the first time because you just want to have a drink, and then you end up sort of chewing these kind of chewy tapioca balls while you're drinking your milk tea. But yes, hugely popular in Taiwan.
Well, I'm going off topic here. We're going off the rails, but the big thing right now here, Ewan, is cheese tea. And it actually kind of started, or at least was made popular in mainland China by this chain that is now hugely popular. It's called Hey Tea. It actually came out a couple of years ago, but it is a young mainland guy. I believe he's in the early 20s, and he founded this chain of tea spots. They actually do not take cash. It's one of the places in China now that doesn't accept cash as payment. So you have to order using the app. And it's kind of like you think of cheese and tea and it sounds disgusting, but this cheese is a little bit more like cream cheese and like a whipped cream kind of cheese. I wouldn't call it cheese as a North American, but they do call it cheese there. And actually, it's amazingly good. It's definitely not a healthy drink. If you're on a diet, you're not going to want to have it. But it has spread quickly. I think Haiti does the best. They're the ones that are known for, but a lot of the bubble tea shops and other tea places are doing their own sort of versions of this cheese tea. And I think it's only a matter of time before you start seeing it back there in T. Ewan.
Okay, well, I'll have to check that out. I'm sure it's here, and I just haven't noticed. But seeing as we're going off the rails, I think we should give a shout out to, and this is a little, it's outside of the Milk Tea Alliance, but coconut coffee in Vietnam is
wow. How is this not
incredible.
A thing back there? There, and I can't even remember the name of the coffee shop now. I'm gonna have to put this in the show notes. We're gonna have a big show notes today. There is a chain of Starbucks like coffee shops, but it's a little bit more industrial than Starbucks. It's not as refined. And I mean, Vietnam's a busy, hectic place. But yeah, they make coconut coffee, and it's made with a lot of coconut cream, it looks like, and some coffee and some ice and a few other things go in there. But yeah, we were down there a few years ago, and we tried it at the recommendation of a cab driver. And after we had it, every day thereafter, we stopped for it. It was a must. And I believe we almost went way out of our way on the day we had to go to the airport just to get a final cup of it.
Oh, it's amazing. I mean, and again, to sort of sum up what it is, it's a coffee frappuccino, but instead of being made with milk, it's made with coconut cream.
Yeah, they do throw a few other things into it. I watched them make it. The base is coconut cream for sure, and then they put a shot or two of espresso, and then or a Vietnamese coffee, and there's a couple other things that go in there, and I can't remember what it is now.
It's magic. I mean, really, if you're a coffee drinker, it's magic, and I'm desperately waiting for it to make its way to Toronto.
Yeah, it's one of those things that it's gonna go there. Something this good can't be confined to the Vietnamese border, inside the Vietnamese borders.
Absolutely.
Right. Okay, Ewan. We are running out of time here, so there's a couple things I just wanted to touch on. One, we do at the end of every show, and we're just going to try this out. I don't know if it's going to work or not, but we do want to, if there's a couple of things that we came across in the week that we think might be interesting to our audience, we want to mention them at the end of the show. It's just a couple of other resources that you might want to check out. I had two items down here, and I kind of sprung it on you, and so it's fine if he doesn't have anything, but one I already mentioned, which was the Tucker Carlson interview with the McKinsey person. I am no fan of Tucker Carlson, but I found that this was one of the first times I was kind of cheering him on because I think people like the person that he interviewed, and what he pushed over the last 20 years is why we are in this problem that we're in today. And I think people of his ilk should be held responsible for that. I think he said some the guy said he had been to China 80 times or something, and it's shocking because he had basic statistics wrong and he could not pronounce Xinjiang. The way he pronounced it was, I think he called it Xinjiang. So, I mean, I cannot believe that he has spent a lot of time in China when you make that kind of mistake. I know that sounds really sort of elitist of me, but if you spent time in China, you will know how to say the place names. It's one of the first things that you would learn, so I'm highly skeptical. But the second thing I wanted to mention, this came on as an accident. So the New York Times does a podcast called The Daily, and I mean, like the name implies, it comes out every day. And the Times was late to this. They jumped on podcast a little bit late, but right away, The Daily has become, one of the most popular shows out there. And it's not a newscast. They really pick one subject and do a podcast on that one subject each day, something that's in the news. And I was actually listening to it for another reason. But when the podcast ended that I was listening to, this one came on, and it was amazing. And it was set in Canada. And it talks about, as a result of COVID-19, people are passing away, and not just from COVID, but many other things as well. And because of the social distancing rules in place, there's no opportunity for people to gather at a person's bedside, or even to say goodbye, or even to hold a funeral. So there's sort of this, these people sort of have not had any closure. A family member or a close friend passes away, and it's just kind of nothing as you wait until this ends to be able to do something. And, what does that do for people's psyche? But in the podcast, it actually talks to a pastor in Southern Ontario who had his wife passed away, and he did an online funeral using Zoom. And he had people connect from all over the world, and they had songs, they had some of the people had played songs on using musical instruments, obviously, and things like that. And it actually became like a full funeral service with a lot of people sharing and connecting. And it was a fascinating show because I think in a way, when it ended, a lot of the people said that actually in some ways it was even better than a traditional funeral, because you were in this Zoom room with everyone, and when someone was sharing, everyone could see their face. They were up close, and everyone could hear that. There wasn't little circles of people talking here and there, and that it was really, really intimate and really touching. And I thought it was an absolutely fantastic look at sort of how this came together and how it went. And so I will put a link to that in the show notes, because I think it's a really nice story.
Yeah, I think one thing I should certainly touch upon before we leave, and you just made me think about it and telling your story, is, of course, the shooting that occurred in Nova Scotia here in Canada. And, shout out to any listeners we may have in the province of Nova Scotia. We're thinking of you guys. And, just an absolutely horrific incident, one of the largest mass shootings we've had in Canadian history, 22 people dead, a lone gunman, at least we still believe it was a lone gunman, who went to a number of locations around the province, killing people. It just really, really horrible situation. And to your point, Cam, it of course has made the service very, very difficult and complicated. Obviously, there's a number of people from across the country who wanted to get out in solidarity with Nova Scotians and show our support, grieve, be present at funeral services. And of course, that's just not really a possibility given what's going on. But they similarly did, and I understand that there was something of a number of local musicians that got involved, and government officials that participated in a Zoom call to try and give everybody an opportunity to grieve and support the community as Canadians. So anyway, I just wanted to put that out there, and a shout out to everybody in Nova Scotia. We're thinking of you guys.
Yeah, very, very sad situation. I mean, sad anytime. It's horrific, but when social distancing is in place, it's even more difficult. And I think you talk about these online gatherings. I think it does show that when when people feel something and when they're really motivated and they want to get together and they want to have a sense of community, that we can overcome these rules and the social distancing and sort of the obstacles that try and keep people apart. We do find ways to come together, and I think that's really quite inspiring.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I don't want to end the show on that note, but I do want to just remind everyone that we will have sort of an extensive show notes for this episode. So please, we talked about a number of different things here, like a mobile app or an application for hosting and attending conferences, the Tucker Carlson interview, the empty plane that Canada had that returned from China, Ewan's story about people in the US and elsewhere being able to sue China. All of this sort of stuff, as well as sort of the story that I told about the conflict between Thailand and China. We will have some links to all of that material in our show notes. As always, please, if you enjoyed the podcast, if you think someone else might enjoy it who please let them know. We don't have a huge marketing budget, so we certainly appreciate if you share it with a friend or a family member. And you can follow us on social media, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Our social account is the same, PR Law Podcast, so PRLAW Podcast. So, twitter.com/PR Law Podcast, Facebook.com/PR Law Podcast, etc., etc. So, for you and Christy, this is Cam Murchie. We'll see